The interview that exposed media bias. Maggie Sullivan's shocking standoff. What happens when a fearless journalist clashes with media's most ruthless host in a live TV showdown that shook the world? One explosive interview, two polarizing voices, and a truth so powerful it shattered careers and ignited a global reckoning. From heated accusations to a jaw-dropping walkout, this is the untold story of the night Maggie Sullivan turned the tables on Ethan Carter and changed journalism forever. Want to witness every shocking twist? Smash that subscribe button and hit the bell because this is one story you won't want to miss. The city of Austin, Texas, was alive with its usual vibrant energy on that warm autumn evening. Nestled in a modest corner of the bustling downtown area, a small studio buzzed with anticipation as preparations were underway for the live broadcast of The Evening Pulse. The show, hosted by Ethan Carter, had built a reputation for its unapologetic and confrontational style. Known for his sharp wit and no-holds-barred approach, Ethan was both admired and feared in equal measure. Tonight's guest, however, promised to be unlike any other. Maggie Sullivan stepped out of her car and took a deep breath, the crisp air filling her lungs. She adjusted the strap of her leather satchel, which contained meticulously prepared notes and research materials. Maggie was no stranger to heated debates. As an independent journalist, she had spent years challenging media bias and advocating for transparency. Her work had earned her a loyal following, but it had also made her a target for critics who dismissed her as overly idealistic or even radical. Still, she approached this appearance with optimism. Ethan Carter, despite his reputation, was a professional, wasn't he? Surely, tonight would be an opportunity to engage in meaningful dialogue about the pressing issues plaguing modern journalism. Inside the studio, the atmosphere was electric. Technicians scurried around, adjusting cameras and checking sound levels. Ethan stood near the host's desk, reviewing his notes while occasionally glancing at the monitor displaying Maggie's profile. He smirked slightly, his sharp features illuminated by the glow of the screen. Maggie Sullivan, a name that had been popping up more frequently in discussions about media accountability. Ethan found her views intriguing but naive. How could someone so young truly understand the complexities of the industry? He intended to expose those perceived flaws during their conversation. When Maggie entered the studio, all eyes turned toward her. She exuded confidence, her tailored beige blazer complementing her warm yet determined demeanor. Her hazel eyes scanned the room briefly before meeting Ethan's gaze. For a moment, there was a flicker of curiosity between them, a silent acknowledgement of the challenge ahead. Ethan extended his hand, offering a polite smile that didn't quite reach his piercing blue eyes. "Miss Sullivan," he said smoothly, "a pleasure to have you here." "The pleasure is mine, Mr. Carter," Maggie replied, her voice steady and calm. Yet beneath her composed exterior, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wouldn't be just another interview. Something about Ethan's demeanor hinted at an underlying agenda, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. As they took their seats, the countdown to the live broadcast began. The red light above the camera blinked on, signaling the start of the program. Ethan wasted no time diving into the topic. "Good evening, viewers, and welcome to the Evening Pulse. Tonight, we're joined by Maggie Sullivan, an independent journalist known for her outspoken stance on media bias. Maggie, thank you for joining us." "Thank you for having me," Maggie responded graciously, leaning slightly forward in her chair. She braced herself, knowing full well that Ethan's charm often masked a razor-sharp edge. Ethan's first question caught her off guard. "Maggie, let's get straight to it. You've been vocal about what you call media manipulation. But isn't it true that independent journalists like yourself often lack accountability? After all, without editorial oversight, how can audiences trust your reporting?" Maggie blinked, momentarily surprised by the directness of the question. She had expected tough questions, but not outright accusations disguised as inquiries. Composing herself quickly, she replied, "Accountability comes from transparency, not necessarily from institutional structures. My work is rooted in verifiable facts and open-source information. If anything, I believe mainstream outlets should adopt similar practices." Ethan raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Verifiable facts? That's quite a bold claim. Let's talk about your recent article criticizing corporate influence in newsrooms. Some might argue that your perspective is biased against traditional media. Isn't it possible that you're simply projecting your own frustrations onto an entire industry?" The tension in the room grew palpable. Maggie felt her pulse quicken, but she maintained her composure. This wasn't going to be easy, but she hadn't come here to back down. Little did she know this was only the beginning of what would become one of the most pivotal nights of her career. The studio lights burned brightly as the conversation between Ethan and Maggie continued, each exchange growing sharper and more charged than the last. What had started as a seemingly straightforward discussion about media bias was rapidly spiraling into something far more personal and dangerous. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his piercing blue eyes fixed on Maggie with an intensity that bordered on condescension. "Let's address this idea of media manipulation," he began, his tone dripping with skepticism. "You claim that corporate interests are distorting the truth. But isn't it possible that your perspective is just as skewed? After all, independent journalists like yourself often operate without any accountability. Who's to say you're not simply pushing your own agenda?" Maggie's jaw tightened ever so slightly, but she maintained her composure. She had anticipated tough questions, but Ethan's approach felt less like a genuine inquiry and more like a calculated attempt to undermine her credibility. Still, she refused to let him rattle her. "Accountability comes from transparency," she replied firmly, her voice steady despite the rising tension. "I publish my sources openly and invite scrutiny. If anything, traditional outlets could learn a thing or two about being transparent." Ethan smirked, clearly unimpressed. "Transparency? That's a convenient buzzword, isn't it? But let's be honest, your work appeals primarily to those who already agree with you. Isn't that just preaching to the choir? How does that contribute to meaningful dialogue?" Maggie tilted her head slightly, her hazel eyes narrowing as she studied him. There was something almost theatrical about Ethan's performance, his polished delivery, his carefully crafted questions designed to provoke rather than enlighten. It was becoming increasingly clear that this wasn't a debate, it was a spectacle, one where Ethan intended to play both prosecutor and judge. "That's an interesting point," Maggie said, choosing her words carefully. "But if we're talking about contributing to dialogue, shouldn't we also consider the role of mainstream media in perpetuating echo chambers? Outlets owned by conglomerates often prioritize profit over truth, tailoring content to suit specific demographics. My goal is to provide alternative perspectives, not to reinforce existing biases." Ethan raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. For a moment there was silence, broken only by the faint hum of the studio equipment. Then with a subtle shift in tone, he moved the conversation in a new direction, one that caught Maggie entirely off guard. "Let's talk about your motivations, Maggie," he said smoothly, leaning forward now, his elbows resting on the desk. "You've built quite a following online, haven't you? Some might argue that your crusade against media bias is less about principle and more about self-promotion. After all, controversy sells." The accusation hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. Maggie felt her pulse quicken, though she managed to keep her outward demeanor calm. This was no longer about ideas or principles, it was personal. Ethan was no longer debating her arguments, he was attacking her. And yet she couldn't afford to lose control. "Not here. Not now. You're entitled to your opinion, Ethan," she said evenly, her voice carrying a quiet authority. "But I think it's important to distinguish between criticism and character assassination. If my work resonates with people, it's because they recognize the need for accountability in journalism. That's not self-promotion, it's advocacy." Ethan chuckled softly, though there was no warmth in it. "Advocacy, you say? Or perhaps a desire to position yourself as the voice of moral righteousness? Tell me, Maggie, do you truly believe that your perspective is the only valid one? Because that sounds an awful lot like the very bias you claim to oppose." The audience watching at home may not have noticed the subtle changes in Maggie's posture, the slight stiffening of her shoulders, the way her fingers gripped the edge of her chair, but Ethan did. He saw the flicker of frustration in her eyes, the barely concealed effort to maintain her composure, and he pressed on, relentless. "What about the broader implications of your work?" he continued, his tone sharpening. "By constantly accusing mainstream media of bias, aren't you fostering distrust in institutions that are essential to democracy? At what point does your crusade for transparency become a threat to social cohesion?" Maggie exhaled slowly, her mind racing. She knew exactly what Ethan was doing. He was trying to paint her as reckless, irresponsible, even dangerous. But she also knew that responding emotionally would only play into his hands. Instead, she chose to meet his rhetoric head-on. "Distress doesn't come from accusations. It comes from actions," she countered, her voice gaining strength. "When people see headlines manipulated for clicks, when they witness stories buried because they don't align with corporate interests, that's when trust erodes. My work isn't about undermining institutions, it's about holding them accountable. And if that makes some people uncomfortable, then so be it." For the first time since the interview began, Ethan seemed momentarily taken aback. Perhaps it was the conviction in Maggie's voice, or the clarity of her argument. Whatever it was, it forced him to recalibrate. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat before launching into another line of questioning, one that would push the conversation into even murkier waters. "Let's talk about ideology then," he said, his tone deliberately provocative. "Some critics have labeled you as an extremist, someone who uses sensationalism to gain attention. Do you think that's fair?" The word extremist hit Maggie like a slap. It was a deliberate attempt to discredit her, to frame her as irrational and unreasonable. But instead of recoiling, she leaned forward, her eyes blazing with determination. "If calling out injustice makes me an extremist, then so be it," she shot back, her voice ringing with defiance. "But let's be clear, this isn't about ideology. It's about integrity. And if holding power to account is considered extreme, then maybe the real issue lies with those who benefit from the status quo." The tension in the room was palpable now, crackling like static electricity. Ethan's smug confidence faltered for a brief moment, replaced by something darker, frustration perhaps, or even anger. He hadn't expected Maggie to fight back so fiercely, to refuse to play the role of the passive guest. This wasn't going according to plan. As the segment wore on, the exchanges grew increasingly heated, each retort sharper than the last. Ethan's attempts to dominate the conversation were met with Maggie's unwavering resolve. By the time the commercial break rolled around, neither participant looked particularly pleased. Ethan's usual charm had given way to thinly veiled hostility, while Maggie's composed exterior masked a simmering fury. Backstage, the production team exchanged uneasy glances. They had seen their share of contentious interviews, but this was different. Something fundamental had shifted during those 20 minutes. A line had been crossed, though neither party seemed willing to acknowledge it yet. When the cameras returned from the break, the atmosphere was heavier, charged with an unspoken understanding that the rest of the interview would be anything but ordinary. The tension in the studio had reached a boiling point. Ethan's relentless barrage of personal attacks and thinly veiled accusations had pushed Maggie to her limits. For the first time since the interview began, her carefully maintained composure started to crack, not out of weakness, but because she realized that silence was no longer an option. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about standing up for the principles she believed in, even if it meant confronting one of the most influential figures in broadcast media. Ethan leaned forward, his tone dripping with condescension as he delivered what he clearly thought would be the final blow. "Let's not mince words here, Maggie," he said, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Your entire narrative hinges on portraying yourself as some kind of crusader for truth. But isn't it possible that you're simply exploiting public distrust for personal gain? After all, controversy sells." The word exploiting hung in the air like a challenge, daring Maggie to respond. And respond she did, but not in the way Ethan expected. Instead of retreating or offering a defensive rebuttal, Maggie fixed him with a steely gaze, her hazel eyes blazing with determination. She leaned forward, her voice steady but laced with quiet fury. "Exploiting," she repeated, her tone icy. "Is that really how you see it, Ethan? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're the one exploiting your platform to push a biased agenda. You call yourself a journalist, but all I've seen tonight is someone more interested in tearing others down than engaging in meaningful dialogue." The audience watching at home collectively held their breath. This was uncharted territory. Ethan Carter, the man known for dominating interviews and reducing guests to stuttering frustration, was being called out, and not just by anyone, but by Maggie Sullivan, who seemed to grow more composed with every passing second. Ethan blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. He hadn't anticipated this level of resistance. Most guests either folded under pressure or resorted to emotional outbursts, giving him the upper hand. But Maggie was different. Her calm demeanor masked a fierce intellect, and her words carried the weight of conviction. Still, Ethan wasn't about to concede defeat. If anything, her defiance only fueled his determination to regain control. "You're accusing me of bias?" he shot back, his voice rising slightly. "That's rich coming from someone who accuses every major outlet of corruption, without presenting a shred of evidence." Maggie raised an eyebrow, unfazed by his attempt to derail the conversation. "Evidence?" she countered, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. I've published detailed reports, cited verifiable sources, and invited scrutiny at every turn. But perhaps you're too busy defending the status quo to notice. Or maybe, she added pointedly, you're part of the problem. The room fell silent. Even the technicians behind the cameras exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that something monumental was unfolding before them. Ethan's jaw tightened, his usual charm replaced by a simmering anger. He opened his mouth to respond, but Maggie didn't give him the chance. This isn't about me, Ethan, she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. It's about holding power accountable. Whether that power comes from corporations, governments, or even individuals like you who use their platforms to manipulate public opinion. Freedom of speech doesn't mean freedom to distort the truth or attack those who dare to question it. Her words struck a nerve. Ethan's expression shifted from irritation to outright hostility. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms as if trying to physically distance himself from the force of her argument. But Maggie wasn't finished yet. And let's talk about transparency, she pressed on, her tone unwavering. You claim to champion free speech, but your show is nothing more than a spectacle designed to provoke outrage. You thrive on conflict, not dialogue. That's not journalism. It's entertainment. And if you can't handle being challenged, then maybe you're in the wrong line of work. The impact of her words was immediate and undeniable. Ethan's face flushed with anger, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might lose his composure entirely. But instead of responding directly, he attempted to pivot back to safer ground, throwing out another provocative comment in hopes of regaining the upper hand. Are you suggesting that my career is built on lies? He demanded, his voice tinged with sarcasm. Because that sounds awfully hypocritical coming from someone who profits off sensationalism. But Maggie didn't take the bait. She simply smiled. A small, knowing smile that conveyed far more than words ever could. I'm not suggesting anything, Ethan, she said calmly. I'm stating facts. And if you can't handle hearing them, then perhaps that says more about you than it does about me. By now the live audience was buzzing with excitement. Social media feeds were lighting up with reactions as viewers debated the merits of Maggie's arguments versus Ethan's increasingly desperate attempts to discredit her. What had started as a routine episode of the Evening Pulse had transformed into a cultural moment, a clash of ideologies played out in real time. For Ethan, the realization was dawning that he had underestimated his opponent. Maggie wasn't just fighting back. She was dismantling his arguments piece by piece, exposing the flaws in his reasoning and challenging the very foundation of his credibility. And as the segment drew to a close, it became painfully clear that this confrontation would have repercussions far beyond the confines of the studio. When the commercial break finally rolled around, the atmosphere was electric. Ethan sat rigidly in his chair, visibly shaken, while Maggie exuded a quiet confidence that spoke volumes. The battle lines had been drawn, and there was no turning back. The moment Maggie walked out of the studio, the atmosphere shifted from tense to explosive. Her abrupt departure wasn't just a personal statement, it was a public declaration that enough was enough. Within minutes, clips of the heated exchange between her and Ethan began circulating online, spreading like wildfire across social media platforms. Hashtags like #MediaBiasExposed and #StandWithMaggie trended globally as viewers weighed in on what had transpired. For Ethan, the fallout was immediate and devastating. What had started as a routine episode of the Evening Pulse quickly spiraled into a PR nightmare. Viewers were divided, but the overwhelming consensus leaned heavily in Maggie's favor. Many praised her for standing up to Ethan's aggressive tactics, while others condemned him for crossing the line from tough journalism to outright hostility. Critics accused him of using his platform not to foster meaningful dialogue, but to bully and belittle those who dared challenge the status quo. Behind the scenes, the production team scrambled to contain the damage. Calls poured in from sponsors demanding explanations, and executives at the network convened an emergency meeting to discuss next steps. Ethan, meanwhile, retreated to his dressing room, visibly shaken. He had always prided himself on his ability to control any situation, to dominate any conversation. But tonight he had been outmaneuvered, and worse, exposed. By morning, the story had made headlines nationwide. News outlets dissected every moment of the interview, analyzing Ethan's behavior and questioning whether his approach had gone too far. Op-eds flooded publications, with some defending his right to ask tough questions, while others argued that his actions amounted to professional misconduct. The court of public opinion had spoken, and it wasn't kind to Ethan. Within 48 hours, the consequences became undeniable. Major advertisers began pulling their support from the Evening Pulse, citing concerns about associating with controversy. Ratings plummeted as audiences turned away in droves, unwilling to tolerate what they perceived as unchecked aggression. Finally, under mounting pressure, the network made the decision to suspend Ethan indefinitely, a move that effectively ended his tenure as host of the show. For Maggie, the aftermath unfolded quite differently. Overnight, she became a symbol of resistance against media bias and unchecked power. Supporters hailed her courage and conviction, sharing her past articles and interviews to highlight her commitment to transparency. Social media buzzed with admiration for her refusal to back down, even in the face of relentless provocation. Invitations poured in from other programs and platforms eager to hear her perspective on the incident and its broader implications. In a follow-up interview with an independent podcast, Maggie addressed the events directly. "This wasn't about me versus Ethan," she explained, her tone measured but firm. "It was about holding people accountable, especially those in positions of influence. Freedom of speech is a cornerstone of democracy, but it comes with responsibility. You can't claim to champion free expression while silencing dissenting voices or distorting the truth." Her words resonated deeply, sparking a wider conversation about the role of media in modern society. Academics, journalists, and activists joined the discourse, debating where to draw the line between free speech and harmful rhetoric. Some argue that Ethan's suspension represented a dangerous precedent, a form of censorship disguised as accountability. Others countered that his actions had undermined trust in journalism itself, making his removal necessary to preserve credibility. Amid the chaos, one thing was clear: the landscape of media was changing. Traditional outlets face growing scrutiny as audiences increasingly turn to independent creators for unfiltered perspectives. Platforms like YouTube, podcasts, and newsletters gain traction, offering alternatives to mainstream narratives. Maggie's rise coincided with this shift, positioning her as a voice of authenticity in an era defined by skepticism and distrust. As weeks passed, the dust began to settle, but the scars remained. Ethan, once a household name, found himself ostracized from the industry he had dominated for decades. Attempts to revive his career fell flat, as potential employers hesitated to associate with someone whose reputation had been irreparably tarnished. Meanwhile, Maggie continued to thrive, leveraging her newfound visibility to advocate for greater accountability in journalism. Reflecting on the experience in a later essay, she wrote, "That night taught me something profound. Change doesn't happen when we stay silent. It happens when we speak up, even if our voices tremble. Standing up to power isn't easy, but it's essential if we want to create a world where truth matters more than profit, where integrity outweighs sensationalism." And so, the ripple effects of that fateful evening in Austin continued to spread, reshaping not only the lives of two individuals but also the broader conversation about media, accountability, and the power of dissent. In the weeks following the explosive confrontation between Maggie Sullivan and Ethan Carter, the broader implications of their clash continued to ripple through society. What had started as a heated exchange in a small Austin studio had evolved into a national conversation about the role of free speech, media accountability, and the responsibilities that come with wielding influence. Maggie seized the opportunity to amplify her message, using her newfound platform to advocate for transparency and integrity in journalism. In a widely shared op-ed titled "The Price of Free Speech," she reflected on the events of that fateful evening and the lessons they held for both creators and consumers of information. "Free speech is a fundamental right, but it is not without boundaries," she wrote. "It carries with it an obligation to seek truth, to respect differing perspectives, and to resist the temptation to distort facts for personal or ideological gain. When we abuse this privilege, whether through deliberate misinformation or unchecked aggression, we erode trust in institutions meant to serve the public good." Her words struck a chord with readers, many of whom were grappling with their own questions about the state of modern media. The incident involving Ethan had exposed a troubling reality. Too often, platforms designed to inform and educate were instead used to manipulate and divide. Yet Maggie's courage in standing up to power offered a glimmer of hope, a reminder that individuals still had the ability to challenge systems and demand better. Meanwhile, Ethan's downfall served as a cautionary tale. Once celebrated for his sharp wit and unflinching style, he became a symbol of what happens when ambition overrides ethics. Interviews with former colleagues revealed a pattern of behavior that prioritized sensationalism over substance, ratings over responsibility. While some sympathized with his plight, arguing that his suspension amounted to censorship, others saw it as a necessary step toward restoring faith in journalism. The debate extended beyond the two individuals involved, sparking discussions in classrooms, boardrooms, and online forums around the world. Academics weighed in on the ethical dilemmas posed by digital media, while activists called for greater regulation to prevent the spread of misinformation. Independent creators, inspired by Maggie's example, began exploring new ways to engage audiences without compromising their values. One such initiative was Voices Unfiltered, a collaborative project launched by Maggie and several like-minded journalists. The platform provided resources and support for independent creators seeking to produce high-quality, fact-based content. It also included workshops on media literacy, empowering viewers to critically evaluate the information they consumed. As time passed, the initial fervor surrounding the incident began to fade, but its impact endured. Networks implemented stricter guidelines for conduct during live broadcasts, ensuring that guests were treated with fairness and respect. Viewers grew more discerning, favoring outlets that demonstrated a commitment to accuracy and accountability. And slowly but surely, the landscape of media began to shift. For Maggie, the experience reinforced her belief in the power of resilience. Speaking at a conference months later, she addressed a packed auditorium with the same quiet confidence that had defined her throughout the ordeal. "That night taught me something profound," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Change doesn't happen when we stay silent. It happens when we speak up, even if our voices tremble." Standing up to power isn't easy, but it's essential if we want to create a world where truth matters more than profit, where integrity outweighs sensationalism. Her closing remarks drew thunderous applause, a testament to the enduring relevance of her message. As she stepped off the stage, reporters clamored for interviews, eager to hear more about her plans for the future. But Maggie simply smiled, knowing that the real work lay ahead, not in accolades or recognition, but in continuing to fight for a more transparent and equitable media landscape. Back in Austin, the studio where it all began stood as a quiet reminder of the night that changed everything. Though the Evening Pulse never returned to air, its legacy lived on as a cautionary tale, a catalyst for change, and ultimately, a testament to the enduring power of truth. And so the story of Maggie and Ethan came full circle. It wasn't just about two individuals locked in conflict. It was about the broader struggle for accountability and justice in an age of uncertainty. Through her courage and conviction, Maggie had proven that sometimes, standing up for what's right could spark a movement, one capable of challenging even the most entrenched systems of power. But here's the kicker. This wasn't the end. What happened after the cameras stopped rolling? The leaked audio, the secret alliances, the scandal that buried a media empire. Stay until the next video drops. Trust me, you'll never see objective reporting the same way again.